Okay, so rather than letting perfect be the enemy of good, I'm going to start producing a variety of data flows tutorials. These have been worked on for quite a while, but I've never been able to quite get the polish I wanted. But people are asking more and more about how to do things, so that's what we're going to get into. So with the first data flow, what we're going to do is write to every single record on the table the word hello world. For those of you unfamiliar with programming, which is probably quite a few of you, hello world is kind of a universal basic first starting principle of learning a new programming language or system. So we're going to write the words hello world to every record on the table in this one. So most of what we do in this one is the setup that we'll use for future tutorials. So, and I'll make a copy of this model available at the various stages like the edX has. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by creating somewhere to store the term hello world. So for the purpose of these tutorials, you're going to want to have a separate folder called data flows at the highest level. And then I'm going to create a new folder here. I'm just going to call it tutorial 1. And I'm going to create a string type field called message. Okay, so tutorial 1's message is now on the table. We've got somewhere to store the information. Now what we need to do is create a data flow that writes the term hello world. So going to data flows, going to new data flow. I'm going to call this one tutorial 1, but the range for this one I'm going to set to be everything in the table. And with the grouping expression, for the time being, it doesn't really matter what you have as your grouping expression, but similar to grouping expressions you might do for, say, dig top down is fine. We're going to address grouping expressions in later tutorials. And then clear fields. We do want to clear fields, and in particular what we want to do is when we run this data flow, we want to make sure that the message gets cleared out. So this just means that the tick box saying yes, clear some fields, and then the second section saying what do you want to clear? Do you want to clear the whole data flow setup, or do you just want to clean certain folders up, certain fields up? So we're going to clear that one field off. The rest of the stuff on this page we're going to ignore. What we're going to do is add an identifier field. Now, identifier fields are text types, similar to how a filter type custom field is a string and a value type custom field is a number. We have value fields and identifier fields. You'll see that a few of them have already been created for us for all of the different levels in your table. But in this example, what I want to do is I want to have another one, and I'm going to call this one message. This is where the data flow is going to write the message hello world to each unit within the actual processing of the data flow. So that's the setup of the data flow complete, except to rename it. So I'm going to rename mine tutorial 1. Just because of the way the screen decides to lay itself out, I'm just going to drag down the diagram so that I've got a little bit of space to create one. And pretty much every data flow is going to have at least, well, it has to pretty much in order for it to work properly, an input block, a processing block, and an output block. And I'm going to just rearrange them a little bit just so that they're all kind of in line. It's a little bit pedantic. And then what we're going to do is, the way that these work is they link from left to right, they link from the right-hand side of the block, but towards the left-hand side of the next block. So I'm going to hold my left mouse button, and you'll see this little arrow start to fire out, and I'm just going to drag the input block to hook up to the processing block, and I'm going to hook the processing block up to the output block. So this is just the way that we make sure that the structure of this all comes in. And to summarize, without getting into too much detail, the input block is where we turn your data, your normal leaf nodes, etc., into what we call units. And units are more like Play-Doh than leaves are. Leaves on a tree are a rigid structure. They can't be split or merged or anything like that. They're kind of in the location. But once something is a unit, it's kind of Play-Doh. You can mix things around before you put them back in the box, which is what we're going to do eventually with the remaining tutorials. So input block, process block, output block, all hooked up. What should happen when we click on any of these now is we shouldn't see any errors. If you see any errors at this point, you've missed a step. Either you've missed your grouping expression, you may have missed one of your connections. If it's still unclear, this would be a point where you would ask for assistance. but assuming that you're seeing some information on your screen as you click around these various blocks, the first thing we're going to do is head over to the processing block, and we're going to add a new processing group, which is effectively a folder. We don't need to give it a name. If you want to give it a name, you can. And we're going to create what's called a new code snippet task, and I'm going to call this one write first message. And in the write first message snippet, what we're going to end up doing is putting a little bit of code in here. Now, the code has already been placed in the video description. Every code snippet will have a version of this, and for the purposes of simplicity, all snippets that you would write would have return units at the bottom of them. It's not technically mandatory, but for the time being, treat it as what we're doing is we're feeding in this sort of this units group that gets fed into the start of each processing block, and at the end we say C# syntax, we say return the units as they've been manipulated or adjusted. Now you can copy and paste this, and you're going to see this kind of thing a lot, but we're saying for every variable type of a unit, capital U meaning the variable type, lowercase unit, you can call this anything you like, but for the purposes of some simplicity, I call it unit, but this is the part that's variable. And then units. So units is this universal terminology for the all of the records that are sort of flowing through the data flow. So for every unit in that list, we're going to set the message text. So message text is the message, our unit identifier field that we created earlier called message, with the word text, and then we're going to say hello world, semicolon at the end. Now, if you have not done any C# programming before, these tutorials will be a little bit more difficult, but you should still be able to follow along. I'm always going to provide the code itself. The purpose of these tutorials is not to teach you how to program. If you are unfamiliar with programming, you want to learn it. Visual Studio Academy, I think it might be called, or Microsoft Academy. There's edX for C#. You don't need to learn as much as what they teach you, but it's a pretty good base of fundamentals. It'll take you a day or two to get through, if not more. But once you have an understanding of C#, you can get quite a lot done. So with that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit recalculate. Now, if you've had an error at this point or a problem, what you're going to get at the tail end of this, like if you've forgotten to say add the semicolon, you will get the error list return, and it will give you some information. Now this, as a beginner, is oftentimes not going to make sense. This would be another example of if you're following along with the tutorials and you're trying to do your own thing, and you struggle with the hitting recalculate and getting error messages, jump on the phone, ask the question. These are generally like 10-second problems that we can fix very, very quickly. So I'm going to hit that recalculate, and on this preview window over on the side, what you'll see immediately is that the column for message, which has already been added for us, very nice of the data flow to do that. If it hadn't been added, similar to using an output schedule view, you can select the column chooser and drag and drop things. So if it wasn't in there, you could drag and drop it in. But you can see that the input and the output, or the before and after, is that we have before this snippet occurred, we have no message, and after we have a message. Now, we're not finished yet. We have one more step. Units themselves don't do anything unless you tell them to go back to the table. So at the moment, the process block does write to each of the units, but right now there's no feedback loop to put the data back into the table, which is what the output block is designed for. So in the output block, what we're going to do is we're going to change the mapping type to the unit's input node. In that, what we're going to do is wherever the unit came from is where it's going to go back to. This is for certain types of processing, this is probably going to be the default. Things like loss and dilution and various other sort of merging and splitting types of logic, you may want to be using other methods, but unit's input node is going to be a pretty good starting place, and that just means, yeah, if it came from one node, it's going to go back there. And then we're going to use the field filter to limit what we're looking at, just to the field filter, just so that we only see stuff to do with data flows. Processing filter and the others, we're not going to do any of the rest of this yet. but what we're going to do is in the actual value for the message is we're going to find that message and we're going to write it back. So we start typing message into the filter. The thing that we want is the identifier for the message, not the field itself, because that's what we're writing to. So if we double click on current message, we're going to get what's called the code word for this. If you're not familiar with expression style syntax, the word message itself, you might have a field called message, you might have a bench called message. It's just a way of saying this is the unit's message field property. So double click, unit message, hit accept. This is all of the setup complete. You should be seeing a preview. When you hit recalculate, if you're not seeing that, let us know. This is all pretty basic at this point, so everything should just be working. And then finally, when you're finished with this and you go back to your table view, currently still no message on any unit, and that's because we haven't run the data flow. So the final component to this is you can either run across all data or you can run it on a range. We're just going to be running this particular data flow by itself. We click run. It says hello world does not exist in the identifier field message. Do you want to add it? Yep, that's fine. We're going to say accept. And we'll go back to the table data view and we have hello world written to all of the units. Now, this is very, very basic. You wouldn't actually use a data flow to do this, but if we don't have that set up, then we won't be able to go much further. That is the end of the first tutorial, and I'll see you on the next one.